My invasive stepdad called me paranoid for thinking his random visits to my bathroom were intentional, laughing at the family BBQ when I mentioned installing a lock on my door. 2 weeks later, I secretly set up a motion-activated camera disguised as an air freshener that sent alerts to my phone. Within 3 days, I had footage of him entering my bathroom at 2 a.m. while I was sleeping, going straight to my laundry basket and sniffing my underwear. The notification hit my phone at 2:17 a.m. on a Wednesday night. I was in bed scrolling through Twitter when the alert vibrated against my palm, the preview showing a dark bathroom and a male figure moving through the doorframe. My stomach dropped before my brain fully processed what I was seeing. The figure wasn't rushing to use the toilet or grab forgotten medication. Gregory walked straight past the sink and toilet, his movements deliberate and practiced, until he reached the wicker laundry basket I kept next to the shower. What happened next made my skin crawl so violently I nearly dropped my phone. I watched through my barely open bedroom door as he emerged 7 minutes later, quietly closing the bathroom door behind him with the careful precision of someone who'd done this many times before. His face in the dim hallway light looked satisfied, almost peaceful, completely unaware that every second had been captured in crisp 1080p video with timestamp and motion tracking. He walked past my door without glancing toward it, disappearing into the master bedroom he shared with my mother like nothing had happened. Gregory had married my mom 4 years ago when I was 15, moving into our house with his tool collection and sports memorabilia, and this instant assumption that he belonged in every corner of our lives. At first, his presence was just annoying in the normal way step-parents are when they try too hard to bond over shared pizza preferences and force family movie nights. But over the past 8 months, something had shifted. The way he'd linger in the hallway when I came out of the shower, how he'd always volunteer to bring laundry upstairs and somehow end up in my room organizing my clothes, his random comments about what I was wearing that felt just a fraction too observant. When I'd mentioned feeling uncomfortable at Easter dinner, my mom had squeezed my shoulder and said Gregory was just trying to be a good stepdad, and I needed to give him more credit. The BBQ incident happened 2 Saturdays ago at my aunt's house, with the whole extended family packed into her backyard for my cousin's graduation party. Gregory had been drinking since noon, getting progressively louder about his opinions on everything from gas prices to college majors. I'd been helping my aunt bring out desserts when I heard him telling my uncle about how I was being difficult about him using my bathroom. Not the family bathroom downstairs. My bathroom. The one connected to my bedroom that I'd specifically asked him to stop entering when I wasn't home. I'd walked over to the conversation, holding a tray of brownies and trying to keep my voice steady, and said that I was planning to install a lock on my bedroom door, just for privacy. Normal teenage privacy that everyone deserves. Gregory had laughed, this booming laugh that made everyone turn to look, and announced to the group that I was paranoid and had been watching too many true crime shows. My mom had smiled apologetically at the relatives and said I was going through a phase about boundaries. My cousin had whispered something about first world problems. Nobody asked why a grown man needed to use his stepdaughter's private bathroom when there was a perfectly functional one downstairs. That night, I'd researched security cameras until 3 a.m., reading reviews and watching installation tutorials and comparing features. The device I'd ordered looked exactly like one of those automatic air freshener dispensers, the white plastic kind that spray every 30 minutes. It arrived in discreet packaging, and I'd installed it the following Wednesday while Gregory was at work and my mom was volunteering at the library. The camera lens was hidden behind a tiny perforated section that looked like a speaker hole, completely invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Motion activation, night vision, live phone alerts, 7-day cloud storage. I'd positioned it on the shelf above my laundry basket, angled perfectly to capture the entire bathroom. The first alert came Thursday night at 11:47 p.m. I was doing homework when my phone buzzed with motion detection. Gregory appeared on the screen, entering my bathroom and opening my medicine cabinet. He spent 4 minutes examining my prescription bottles, reading labels, taking photos with his phone. The violation felt like insects crawling under my skin. The second alert came Saturday afternoon while I was at work. He entered at 2:13 p.m., went straight to my shower, and smelled my shampoo and body wash. Stood there for 6 minutes just holding the bottles and breathing them in like some kind of demented perfume tester. But this third alert, this Wednesday night footage of him going through my laundry basket and holding my underwear to his face while his other hand disappeared into his pocket, This was evidence of something I could no longer convince myself was just boundary issues or stepdad awkwardness. I watched the 7-minute video 3 times that night, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. In the morning, I transferred the files to a locked folder on my laptop, backed them up to 2 separate cloud accounts, and sent copies to my personal email. Then I got dressed, ate breakfast with my mom and Gregory like nothing had happened, and went to my college classes while my brain worked through exactly what needed to happen next. Gregory had spent years building this perfect image of himself as the helpful stepdad, the reliable husband, the guy who coaches Little League and volunteers for Neighborhood Watch. He'd called me paranoid in front of my entire extended family, turning my legitimate concerns into a joke about an oversensitive teenager who couldn't handle having a father figure in her life. He'd made my own mother question my judgment, made her choose his comfort over my safety, made her believe his bathroom visits were innocent, and my discomfort was the real problem. But now I had proof. 3 separate incidents captured in perfect detail, with dates and timestamps, and his face clearly visible in night vision. The police would have all the evidence they needed for criminal charges. My mom would finally have to see what I'd been trying to tell her. The family would understand why I'd wanted that lock on my door. And Gregory's carefully constructed reputation would shatter like dropped glass, revealing exactly what kind of person had been living in our house all these years. I had 17 days of footage ahead of me before confronting anyone. 17 days to document patterns, gather evidence, and build a case so airtight that not even my mother's desperate love could deny what was happening. And while Gregory went about his days thinking he'd successfully gaslit me into silence, I would be watching every move, collecting every incident, and preparing to burn his entire world to the ground. Thursday morning, I sat in my intro to psychology class, barely hearing the lecture on behavioral patterns, while my phone buzzed with its 4th motion alert in 6 days. This one came at 6:23 a.m., 30 minutes before my alarm. Gregory entering my bathroom while I was still asleep, checking under my sink cabinet, photographing the contents. The professor was explaining something about classical conditioning, and I was watching my stepdad document my personal hygiene products like he was conducting some kind of perverse research project. I'd started keeping detailed logs in a password-protected document: date, time, duration of each incident, description of what he did, screenshots of the footage with visible timestamps. Wednesday, 2:17 a.m., 7 minutes, laundry basket violation. Thursday, 11:47 p.m., 4 minutes, medicine cabinet inspection. Saturday, 2:13 p.m., 6 minutes, shower products. And now Thursday, 6:23 a.m., 9 minutes, under-sink photography session. 4 incidents in 6 days, and the pattern was getting bolder. My phone buzzed again during lunch, but this time it wasn't a motion alert. It was my mom texting to ask if I'd be home for dinner because Gregory was grilling steaks and wanted to know if I preferred medium or medium rare. The casual domesticity of the message, while I had video evidence of her husband violating my privacy, made me want to throw my phone across the cafeteria. Instead, I replied that I had to work late, which was true, and that she shouldn't wait up, which was a lie because I'd be home by 9. I'd picked up extra shifts at the campus bookstore specifically to avoid being home more than necessary. My coworker Jasmine had noticed I'd been jumpy and distracted, dropping books and startling at sudden movements. When she'd asked if everything was okay at home, I'd almost told her everything right there between the psychology textbooks and study guides. But I stopped myself because I needed this documented properly, legally, before I told anyone outside my immediate plan. That plan was forming slowly, carefully, like building a house of cards where one wrong move would collapse everything. I needed enough evidence that nobody could dismiss it as a misunderstanding or overreaction. I needed footage that showed clear intent and pattern behavior, not just isolated incidents that Gregory could explain away. And I needed a strategy for revealing everything that wouldn't give him time to delete evidence or manipulate my mother before she saw the truth. Friday afternoon, I met with campus security under the pretense of asking about dorm room safety for next semester. The security officer, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who'd worked at the university for 15 years, had answered my carefully casual questions about video evidence and police reports and restraining orders. She'd mentioned that the campus had partnerships with local law enforcement and victim advocacy groups, giving me brochures about resources I pretended were for a friend's situation. Patricia had looked at me with knowing eyes and said that friends who need help should always reach out sooner rather than later, and that evidence collection was crucial in cases involving family members. That night, the motion alert came at 1:43 a.m. I'd fallen asleep with my phone on my chest, jolting awake when the vibration buzzed against my ribs. Gregory again, this time spending 11 minutes in my bathroom. He went through my laundry basket more thoroughly this time, pulling out items one by one and examining them under the nightlight I kept plugged in near the mirror. The footage showed him holding up a sports bra I'd worn to the gym that afternoon, bringing it to his face, his body language suggesting things I couldn't force myself to fully acknowledge, even as I watched it happen in real time. I'd gotten out of bed, unlocked my bedroom door as quietly as possible, and stood in the hallway listening to the sounds coming from my bathroom. The soft rustling of fabric, his breathing slightly elevated, the occasional creak of floorboards as he shifted position. My bedroom was only 15 feet from that bathroom door, close enough that I could have walked over and confronted him right then, caught him literally in the act with my underwear in his hands. But confrontation wasn't the goal. Exposure was. Saturday morning, my mom asked why I'd been so quiet lately, if something was bothering me at school or work. We were sitting at the kitchen table, just the two of us, because Gregory had gone to Home Depot for supplies for some project. I'd looked at her over my coffee mug, this woman who'd raised me alone for 11 years before Gregory showed up, who'd worked double shifts to pay for my dance lessons and field trips, who'd always told me I could talk to her about anything. And I'd wanted so badly to show her the videos right then, to make her see what was happening 15 feet from where we were sitting. But instead I'd said that finals were stressing me out, and I was just tired, and she'd squeezed my hand and said I should take a break from working so many shifts at the bookstore. The guilt of lying to her felt like swallowing glass, but I knew that showing her prematurely would give Gregory time to manipulate the situation, to claim I'd doctored the videos or set him up or was trying to break up their marriage out of teenage resentment. Sunday afternoon, while Gregory and my mom were at his brother's house for a birthday party, I'd claimed I couldn't attend due to work. I went to every room he had access to and documented everything. I photographed his nightstand drawer where he kept a locked metal box I'd never seen opened. I checked the garage where his tools were organized with obsessive precision, finding a shelf with items that made my stomach turn. A women's clothing catalog with pages dog-eared and notes in margins. A small photo album containing pictures of me from family events, some cropped to remove other people from the frame. A notebook with dates and times that aligned too closely with my work schedule to be coincidental. I photographed everything with my phone, careful to capture surrounding context that proved these items belonged to Gregory and weren't planted. The catalog was on his workbench next to his tool set. The photo album was behind his fishing tackle box on a shelf that only he used. The notebook was inside a storage container labeled with his company name. Each piece of evidence added another layer to a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to look at directly. Monday morning, I woke up to my 6th motion alert. This one came at 5:47 a.m., 20 minutes before I needed to wake up for an early class. Gregory entered my bathroom, went straight to the laundry basket, and this time his visit lasted 14 minutes. The footage showed him sitting on the edge of my bathtub holding multiple items from the basket, his free hand moving in a way that made me close the video after 10 seconds. I sat in my bed with my knees pulled to my chest, feeling violated in ways I didn't have words for, knowing that in the morning I'd have to sit across from him at breakfast and pretend I didn't know what he'd been doing while I slept. That afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice introduced herself as Detective Sarah Chen from the local police department's Special Victims Unit. My heart stopped completely until she explained that Patricia from campus security had reached out on behalf of a student seeking advice about a sensitive family situation, and that the detective was available for a confidential consultation if I wanted to discuss evidence collection and legal options. I'd sat in my car in the campus parking lot for 90 minutes talking to Detective Chen about video evidence admissibility, criminal charges related to invasion of privacy and voyeurism, the process of obtaining restraining orders, and how to handle situations where the perpetrator was a family member living in the victim's home. She'd been professional and direct, not pressing for details but providing clear information about what constituted prosecutable behavior and how to document it properly. Before hanging up, she'd given me her personal cell number and said to call anytime, day or night, when I was ready to move forward. Tuesday night, the 7th alert came at 10:34 p.m. while I was finishing an essay in my bedroom. I'd heard Gregory tell my mom he was going to bed early because he had an early job site meeting Wednesday morning. Instead, according to the timestamp, he'd waited until my mom was absorbed in her book club video call, then entered my bathroom for the 4th time in 8 days. This visit lasted 16 minutes. 16 minutes of him going through my personal belongings while my mother was 30 feet away, discussing contemporary fiction with her friends. I saved the footage, added it to my log, and sent another backup to my email account. 10 days of evidence, 7 separate incidents. Clear escalation in frequency and duration. Photos of disturbing items in his workspace. A detective's contact information saved in my phone. And Gregory had absolutely no idea that every violation he committed was building the case that would destroy him. Wednesday afternoon, I got a text from my aunt asking if I wanted to come over for dinner Friday night. Just her and my uncle and me. No pressure, but she'd been thinking about the BBQ conversation and wanted to check in. My aunt had always been perceptive, the one family member who'd actually seemed uncomfortable with how Gregory had laughed off my concerns. I texted back that Friday would be great and started planning exactly how much I could tell her without compromising what came next. Thursday morning marked 11 days of documentation and my 8th motion alert. This one came at 3:52 a.m., jolting me awake with the phone vibration. Gregory's visit lasted 19 minutes. 19 minutes of footage that I couldn't watch beyond the first minute because seeing him sit on my bathroom floor surrounded by my personal items while doing things I refused to fully process was beyond what I could handle even for evidence purposes. I let the video run, the cloud storage automatically saving everything, and lay in my bed with my pillow pressed against my ears, trying not to hear the sounds coming from down the hallway. At breakfast that morning, Gregory asked if I'd been sleeping okay because he'd noticed dark circles under my eyes. My mother looked up from her yogurt with immediate concern, and I'd wanted to scream that yes, actually I'd been sleeping terribly because I kept getting alerts that her husband was violating my privacy while she slept 15 feet away completely oblivious. Instead, I blamed finals week stress and too much caffeine, accepting her offer to make me some chamomile tea to help me sleep better. Gregory had smiled at me across the table with this expression of stepfatherly concern, and I'd smiled back while mentally calculating exactly how much longer I had to maintain this performance. My evidence folder now contained 8 incidents over 11 days, photos from his garage, Detective Chen's contact information, and increasingly detailed notes about his patterns. He always waited until after midnight. He always spent progressively longer periods of time in my bathroom. He always went straight to the laundry basket first before exploring other areas. And he always looked satisfied afterward, like someone who'd successfully gotten away with something. Friday evening, I drove to my aunt's house for dinner, the 30-minute drive giving me time to organize my thoughts into something coherent. My Aunt Teresa and Uncle Mike lived in a quiet neighborhood with a backyard full of garden beds and wind chimes, the kind of peaceful space that felt like another world from the tension filling my own home. Teresa had made lasagna and garlic bread, and we'd spent the first hour catching up on school and work, and normal surface-level conversation before she'd finally asked what was really going on. I'd shown her the videos, not all of them, because I couldn't bring myself to share the worst footage even with family, but enough to establish the pattern. Her face had gone from confused to horrified to furious in the span of about 3 minutes. Uncle Mike had watched silently, his jaw getting tighter with each clip, and when I'd finished explaining the full timeline, he'd asked very quietly if I'd contacted police yet. That's when I'd explained my plan. Show my mother first, let her see the evidence without Gregory present to manipulate the situation. Document her initial reaction and decision about whether to support me or defend him. Then, regardless of her response, contact Detective Chen and pursue criminal charges. File for a restraining order. Move out immediately, staying with Teresa and Mike until I could arrange something more permanent. Let the legal system handle Gregory while I focused on not letting this destroy the parts of my life I'd built outside that house. Teresa had insisted I move in that night, immediately, before going back home at all. But I'd explained that I needed a few more days to finish preparations, to transfer important documents and belongings to a storage unit I'd rented that week, to make sure everything was in place before the confrontation that would inevitably explode my family into pieces. She'd made me promise to call her immediately if anything escalated, given me a spare key to their house, and told me that no matter what happened with my mother, I would always have a place with them. Saturday afternoon, while Gregory and my mom were out grocery shopping, I'd systematically moved anything irreplaceable out of my room. Photo albums from before Gregory existed in our lives, jewelry from my grandmother, important documents like my birth certificate and social security card, my laptop with all its backed up evidence. Everything went into boxes that I loaded into my car and drove to the storage unit across town. My room afterward looked exactly the same to casual observation, but anyone who actually lived there would eventually notice that the meaningful items had been strategically removed. The ninth motion alert came Saturday night at 11:48 p.m. I was lying in bed reading when the notification hit, and this time I didn't even open the video. Just let it record, let the cloud storage save it automatically, added the timestamp to my log. 23 minutes, his longest visit yet. I turned up my music and read the same paragraph of my book 7 times, without absorbing a single word until my phone showed he'd finally left my bathroom and returned to the bedroom he shared with my mother. Sunday morning at breakfast, my mom mentioned that Gregory's company was sending him to a training conference in Phoenix next weekend, Friday through Monday, and she was thinking about visiting her sister in Portland while he was gone, a 4-day window where I'd have the house to myself, where I could exist without hypervigilance and constant alerts and pretending everything was normal. I'd told her that sounded great, that I'd be fine alone, and managed to keep my expression neutral when Gregory said he'd miss his girls, but the training was important for a promotion he was hoping to get. Monday afternoon, I met with Detective Chen in person for the first time, sitting in her office at the police station while she reviewed the evidence I'd compiled over the past 13 days. She'd been quiet for a long time, taking notes, occasionally asking clarification questions about dates and my living situation, and whether I'd told anyone else besides my aunt about the footage. When she'd finished, she'd explained that what I'd documented constituted multiple criminal charges including invasion of privacy, voyeurism, and potentially other charges depending on what prosecutors determined from reviewing the complete evidence. Detective Chen had outlined 2 options. I could file charges immediately, which would likely result in Gregory's arrest within 24-48 hours, and a temporary restraining order barring him from our home while the case proceeded. Or I could wait until I was ready to move out first, ensuring I had stable housing secured before triggering the legal process that would turn my family inside out. She'd also gently suggested that I should prepare myself for the possibility that my mother might not react the way I hoped, that family members sometimes chose to protect the perpetrator rather than believe the victim, and that I should have a support system in place regardless of how she responded. I'd left the police station with paperwork to fill out when I was ready to formally file charges, Detective Chen's direct number programmed into my phone, and a sick feeling in my stomach about having to plan for my own mother potentially choosing Gregory over me. But I'd also left with validation that what I'd experienced was serious enough for criminal prosecution, that my documentation had been thorough and admissible, and that I wasn't overreacting or being paranoid like Gregory had claimed at that BBQ. Tuesday night brought the 10th alert at 1:37 a.m., 17 minutes, still escalating. I'd stopped watching the videos entirely by this point, just let them record and save automatically while I lay in bed with headphones playing music loud enough to drown out any sounds from the hallway. In the morning, I'd added the timestamp to my log, noting that we were now averaging 1 incident every 1. 4 days, with duration increasing by approximately 2 minutes per incident following the initial baseline. Wednesday afternoon, I'd signed a lease for a studio apartment 15 minutes from campus, paying first month in security deposit from money I'd been saving for over a year from my bookstore job. Move-in date was set for the following Saturday, the day my mom would be in Portland and Gregory would be in Phoenix. I'd arranged to have Teresa, Mike, and 2 of their adult sons help me move out while my mother and Gregory were both gone, leaving only a note explaining that I'd needed more independence as a college student and would be in touch soon about picking up remaining belongings. The coward's exit, maybe. But after watching Detective Chen's expression while she reviewed my evidence, after hearing her warnings about potential family dynamics, after seeing my aunt's horror and my uncle's barely controlled rage, I'd accepted that the confrontation I'd been planning would need to happen from a position of safety, rather than from inside the house where Gregory could control the narrative or intimidate me into backing down. Thursday morning, my mom asked if I wanted to go dress shopping with her on Sunday for a wedding we were attending in June, completely oblivious that by Sunday I'd be living in a different location and probably not speaking to her depending on how she reacted to what I was about to reveal. I'd agreed to the shopping trip, maintaining the charade for 3 more days, while my phone continued logging evidence that would destroy any chance of a normal family relationship ever existing again. That night, the 11th alert came at 2:04 a.m., 21 minutes. I didn't open the video, just stared at the notification on my dark phone screen, counting down the hours until Saturday when I could leave this house and never feel that violation again, when I could finally stop performing normalcy while documented proof of Gregory's predatory behavior accumulated in cloud storage that he didn't even know existed. Saturday morning, I woke up at 6:30 a.m. in my new studio apartment, having moved the last box out of my mother's house at midnight the previous night while she was in Portland and Gregory was in Phoenix. Teresa, Mike, and their sons had worked like a coordinated moving team, emptying my room of everything that mattered in less than 4 hours. I'd left behind furniture, a few random clothes, and a sealed envelope on my desk addressed to my mother with a note saying I'd needed space to focus on school and would explain everything when she got back. The 12th and final motion alert had come Friday night at 11:56 p.m., just minutes before I'd pulled out of the driveway for the last time as a resident of that house. Gregory had been in Phoenix for his conference, or so my mother thought, but the camera footage showed him entering my bathroom at the house, proving he'd either never gone to Phoenix or had come back early specifically to access my room, while he thought everyone was gone. 24 minutes, his longest violation yet. And his last, because I'd left a note of my own for him taped to the bathroom mirror. The note was simple. Smile for the camera. Evidence has been preserved. Detective Sarah Chen, Special Victims Unit. With her direct phone number printed below, I'd set my phone to alert me when the motion sensor detected him finding the note. The notification came at 12:47 a.m. Saturday morning. The footage showed Gregory reading the note, his face going completely white in the night vision camera, then frantically looking around the bathroom trying to locate the device. He'd torn through the shelves, knocked over products, even unscrewed the air freshener I'd already removed. The camera I'd left in place was a decoy, a fake device with no recording capability positioned exactly where someone would expect to find a hidden camera. The real evidence had been in a completely different unit I'd retrieved Wednesday night that he'd never even noticed. Sunday morning at 9:23 a.m., I got the call from my mother. She'd arrived home from Portland to find my room mostly empty, Gregory frantically trying to reach her with 17 missed calls, and my note saying I'd moved out. Her voice was confused, hurt, asking why I couldn't have just talked to her about needing space instead of sneaking out like I was running away from something terrible. I'd taken a deep breath and told her I needed her to come to Teresa's house immediately, alone, and that I had something to show her that couldn't be discussed over the phone. She'd started to ask more questions, but I'd cut her off with a firmness I'd never used with her before. Alone, Mom. Without Gregory. This is not negotiable. She'd arrived at Teresa's house 40 minutes later, still in the clothes she'd traveled in, looking smaller somehow than I'd ever seen her. Teresa had set us up in the living room with coffee. Neither of us would drink, then left to give us privacy while staying close enough to intervene if necessary. I'd sat across from my mother with my laptop and watched her face as I showed her the evidence I'd compiled over 17 days. The first video played. Friday night, 11:47 p.m., Gregory entering my bathroom and going through my medicine cabinet. My mother's expression went from confused to concerned. The second video. Saturday afternoon, 2:13 p.m., Gregory smelling my shower products. Her face started losing color. The third video. Wednesday, 2:17 a.m., Gregory at my laundry basket. She'd actually gasped, her hand covering her mouth. I didn't show her the worst footage. The details of exactly what he'd been doing during those progressively longer visits weren't necessary for her to understand the violation. I showed her enough to establish the pattern, the escalation, the calculated timing of his visits while she slept or I was gone. I showed her the photos from his garage, the notebook with my schedule, the photo album with cropped pictures of me. And I showed her the police report I'd filed Saturday afternoon after moving out, the formal criminal charges Detective Chen had helped me document, the restraining order that would be served to Gregory within the next 24 hours. My mother had cried. Deep, broken sobs that shook her entire body while she stared at the paused video on my laptop screen, showing her husband in our daughter's bathroom at 2 a.m. holding her underwear. She'd asked how long, And I'd told her about the BBQ where I'd tried to warn everyone and been dismissed as paranoid. She'd asked why I didn't tell her sooner, and I'd explained that I'd needed evidence because nobody believed me without it. That even she had chosen his comfort over my concerns when I'd mentioned the bathroom visits months ago. There was a long silence where I could see her processing everything, see the exact moment she had to choose between the man she'd married 4 years ago and the daughter she'd raised for 19 years. Her face went through several expressions: grief, anger, disbelief, horror, before settling on something I'd been terrified I wouldn't see: protective fury. She'd asked what I needed from her. Not whether the evidence was real or if I might be misinterpreting his behavior, or if maybe we could all sit down and talk about this like a family. Just a simple, clear question about what I needed her to do. I'd almost cried with relief. I told her I needed her to not warn Gregory about the restraining order, to let it be served by police so he couldn't prepare a defense or dispose of evidence. I needed her to not defend him to family members when this became public, to not make excuses about misunderstandings or stress or mental health struggles that somehow justified his behavior. And I needed her to decide quickly whether she was staying married to a man who'd spent nearly 3 weeks violating his stepdaughter's privacy in increasingly disturbing ways. She'd pulled out her phone right there and called a divorce attorney whose number she'd gotten from a friend years ago during a rough patch in her previous marriage, made an appointment for Tuesday morning. Then she'd called my Uncle Mike and asked him to please come help her change the locks on every door in the house while Gregory was still in Phoenix. My phone buzzed at 2:47 p.m. with a call from an unknown number. I'd answered to hear Gregory's voice, tight with panic, asking where I was and what the hell I thought I was doing making up lies about him to police. I'd put him on speaker so my mother and aunt could hear. I'd told him very calmly that every word of my police report was documented, truth-backed by video evidence with timestamps, and his face clearly visible, that Detective Chen had confirmed the footage supported multiple criminal charges, and that he should probably use his time before being served with a restraining order to find himself a good criminal defense attorney, rather than calling me with threats. He'd started yelling then, his voice escalating into rage about how I'd set him up, planted evidence, fabricated everything because I'd never accepted him as a father figure, and wanted to ruin his marriage to my mother. The performance was impressive, actually. The wounded innocence, the righteous anger, the accusations that I was an ungrateful, vindictive child trying to destroy a good man's life because I couldn't handle having rules and structure. My mother had taken the phone from my hand. Her voice was ice when she spoke. "Gregory, I've seen the videos. I've seen the photos of what you kept in the garage. I've seen the notebook where you tracked her schedule. The police have all of it. I have all of it, and in case you're thinking about coming home to destroy evidence, Mike is changing all the locks right now, and you are not welcome in this house ever again. I've contacted a divorce attorney. Do not call this number again. Do not call Megan. Do not contact anyone in this family. Any communication goes through lawyers from this point forward." She'd hung up before he could respond. Then she'd turned to me with tears streaming down her face and apologized for not believing me sooner, for choosing his feelings over my safety, for not seeing what was happening in her own house while she'd been too caught up in wanting her second marriage to work. The restraining order was served Sunday evening, while Gregory was still trying to call my mother from different phones, each number she immediately blocked. According to Detective Chen, he'd been at a hotel near the Phoenix airport when police found him, having never actually attended any conference. He'd lied about the entire trip, probably planning to spend the weekend accessing my room while everyone believed he was out of state. The hotel room search had turned up more evidence, items I didn't want details about, that added charges to what he was already facing. Monday morning, my phone exploded with messages from extended family. Gregory had apparently sent a mass text to everyone claiming I'd fabricated evidence to frame him, that my mother had turned against him based on lies, that the family needed to know the truth before his reputation was destroyed by a vindictive teenager with psychological problems. Several relatives had called my mother demanding explanations. She'd responded to each one with a brief, clear statement that Gregory had been caught on video repeatedly violating my privacy, that police had evidence supporting criminal charges, and that anyone who wanted to maintain a relationship with her or me needed to understand that there would be no debate about what had happened. My aunt from the BBQ had called me directly, crying, apologizing for laughing when Gregory had dismissed my concerns about locks on doors. She'd seen his mass text, and wanted me to know that she believed me completely and felt sick about not taking my discomfort seriously. 3 other relatives had sent similar messages, horror and apology and support, while the ones Gregory had managed to convince with his victim narrative showed themselves out by defending him publicly. Tuesday afternoon, while my mother was meeting with her divorce attorney, I got a notification that Gregory had been formally arrested and charged with multiple counts including voyeurism, invasion of privacy, and possession of evidence that suggested ongoing surveillance. His bail was set high enough that unless his family came through with money, he'd be waiting in jail for his trial date. Detective Chen called to tell me that the evidence I'd collected was some of the most thorough documentation she'd seen in a case like this, that my systematic approach to recording patterns and preserving footage had made the prosecutor's job significantly easier. That evening, I sat in my new studio apartment, my mother helping me unpack boxes and set up furniture, and realized that the life I'd been living for 17 days of documentation, plus 4 years of subtle discomfort, was officially over. Gregory's career was destroyed, his marriage was ending, his reputation was obliterated, and he was facing criminal charges that could result in years of legal consequences. And I was safe, believed, supported, and finally able to exist in my own space without alerts on my phone telling me my privacy was being violated while I slept. The preliminary hearing happened 3 weeks after Gregory's arrest. I sat in the courtroom between my mother and Teresa, watching the prosecutor present evidence to determine if there was probable cause to proceed to trial. The judge reviewed selected footage from my documentation, the photos from Gregory's garage, witness statements from family members about the BBQ incident where I'd been dismissed as paranoid, and expert testimony about surveillance patterns and escalating predatory behavior. Gregory's defense attorney tried arguing that the videos were inadmissible because I'd recorded him without consent in what he considered a private space. The prosecutor had calmly pointed out that Gregory also hadn't had consent to be in my private bathroom at 2 a.m. going through my personal belongings, and that recording someone committing a crime in your own home is completely legal. The judge agreed, and probable cause was established in less than 90 minutes. Trial was scheduled for 8 weeks out. What Gregory didn't know yet, because his attorney apparently hadn't bothered to fully review all the evidence, was that the camera footage was only part of what prosecutors had. His phone records showed location data proving he'd lied about the Phoenix conference, that he'd actually been at a hotel 30 minutes from our house the entire weekend. The hotel room search had recovered items that connected him to purchases he'd made at stores near where I worked and went to school, suggesting surveillance that extended beyond our home. And his computer history, seized with a warrant after his arrest, revealed searches about hidden cameras, how to tell if someone was monitoring you, and forums discussing voyeurism that dated back 14 months. The family fallout was extensive and permanent. Gregory's brother, the one whose birthday party I'd skipped, had initially tried defending him until his wife sat him down and explained exactly what the charges meant. She'd apparently told him that if he couldn't understand why a grown man repeatedly entering his stepdaughter's bathroom at night to go through her underwear was predatory behavior, then maybe she needed to reconsider whether their own teenage daughter was safe around him. The brother had backed off immediately and sent my mother an apology for initially questioning her judgment. Gregory's parents, however, had doubled down on defending him. His mother had actually shown up at my mom's workplace 2 weeks after the arrest, demanding to speak to her about dropping the charges and working things out for the sake of their marriage. My mother had told her very clearly that there was no marriage left to save, that her son had violated my privacy repeatedly and deliberately, and that she needed to leave immediately, or security would escort her out. Gregory's father had sent threatening letters about family loyalty and legal action for defamation that Detective Chen had forwarded to the prosecutor as potential witness intimidation. The absolute best part of Gregory's downfall came from his employer. The construction company he'd worked for had a strict morality clause in their contracts, particularly for supervisors who might be working near residential areas with families present. When news of his arrest and charges became public record, they'd not only fired him immediately, but also revoked his licensing certifications by reporting the charges to the state board. Even if Gregory somehow avoided prison time, his career in construction supervision was permanently finished. His carefully built reputation in our neighborhood had disintegrated even faster. The homeowners association he'd been so active in had removed him from all committees. His Little League coaching position had been terminated the day after his arrest. Neighbors who'd waved and chatted with him for 4 years suddenly remembered concerning moments they'd dismissed at the time, like how he'd always volunteered to help the teenage daughter next door with yard work when her parents weren't home, or how he'd seemed oddly interested in which families had daughters and what their schedules were. 6 weeks after his arrest, Gregory's defense attorney had approached the prosecutor about a plea deal. He wanted to avoid trial, avoid having the complete evidence presented publicly, avoid the possibility of maximum sentencing if a jury found him guilty on all charges. The prosecutor had told his attorney that they weren't interested in deals, that the evidence was overwhelming and they were confident about conviction, but they'd listen to what he wanted to offer. Gregory's attorney had proposed pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a recommendation of probation instead of prison time. He'd argued that Gregory had no prior criminal record, that he'd been going through personal struggles that led to poor judgment, that prison would destroy any chance he had of rehabilitation and rebuilding his life. The prosecutor had forwarded the proposal to Detective Chen, who'd called me to discuss whether I wanted to accept a deal that would guarantee conviction, but potentially lighter sentencing. I'd told Detective Chen that I wanted trial. I wanted every piece of evidence presented publicly in court records that would be accessible forever. I wanted a jury of 12 people to see exactly what Gregory had done and decide for themselves what he deserved. I wanted him to have to sit in a courtroom while footage of his violations played on screens that his family and former friends and community members could witness. No deals, no reduced charges, no possibility of him spinning this into a mental health struggle or a momentary lapse in judgment. The prosecutor had declined the plea offer. Trial proceeded as scheduled. The trial lasted 4 days. The prosecution presented video evidence chronologically, showing the escalation pattern from Thursday night medicine cabinet inspection to Wednesday night laundry basket violations. They showed photos from his garage, presented his notebook with my schedule, displayed his phone's location data proving he'd lied about Phoenix. Digital forensics experts testified about his computer search history and the forums he'd participated in, where users shared strategies for hiding surveillance and avoiding detection. My mother testified about how I'd tried to tell her about feeling uncomfortable, about the BBQ where Gregory had publicly dismissed my concerns as paranoia. Teresa testified about showing her the evidence and my planning to move out before confronting anyone. Detective Chen testified about the thoroughness of my documentation and how rare it was to have such clear evidence in cases like this. Gregory's defense attorney tried arguing that the behavior, while inappropriate, didn't rise to the level of the charges being prosecuted. That going into someone's bathroom wasn't the same as actually harming them. That having photos and notes wasn't proof of criminal intent. The prosecutor had calmly asked if the attorney would feel the same way if it was his teenage daughter whose stepfather was photographing her schedule and keeping albums of her pictures and spending 20-minute sessions in her bathroom at 2 a.m. while she slept. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, guilty on all charges. Sentencing happened 2 weeks later. The judge had reviewed victim impact statements from me, my mother, Teresa, and even the neighbor whose daughter Gregory had volunteered to help with yard work. The statements described the violation, the betrayal of trust, the damage done not just to me but to my mother who'd believed she was married to a decent man, to the community who'd welcomed him into youth programs and neighborhood activities. Gregory was sentenced to 6 years in state prison, followed by 10 years of supervised probation, with lifetime registration as a sex offender. No possibility of early release. The judge had explicitly stated that the systematic nature of his behavior, the clear escalation pattern, and his attempts to intimidate family members after being caught demonstrated that he posed an ongoing threat that required substantial incarceration. Gregory's mother had screamed from the gallery that it was too harsh, that they were destroying his life over videos that didn't even show him touching anyone. The judge had calmly responded that Gregory had destroyed his own life by making the choice to repeatedly violate his stepdaughter's privacy in increasingly disturbing ways, and that consequences were not the same as victimhood, regardless of how his family wanted to frame it. I'd watched Gregory being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his face aged years in the 2 months since his arrest, and felt absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, no lingering anger. Just a complete absence of the fear and violation I'd lived with for months before installing that camera. He was gone. His life was ruined. And I was free. The divorce was finalized 3 months after sentencing. My mother kept the house, her retirement accounts, and everything else except items that were specifically Gregory's property before the marriage, which she'd packed into boxes and left at his parents' house with a note that she never wanted to see or hear from their family again. Gregory's name was removed from all accounts, all documents, all photos. It was like those 4 years of marriage had been systematically erased, except for the legal records proving why. My mother had started therapy to process the betrayal, the guilt about not believing me sooner, the violation of having shared her bed with someone capable of what Gregory had done. She'd sold the house 6 months after the trial, unable to live in a space that held so many memories of the marriage she'd thought was real. She'd bought a smaller place closer to downtown, redecorated completely, and created a space that had never known Gregory's presence. A year after his sentencing, I was thriving in ways I hadn't thought possible during those 17 days of documentation. I'd transferred to a 4-year university, maintained a 3.8 GPA while working part-time, started dating someone who respected boundaries without having to be told what appropriate behavior looked like. My relationship with my mother had actually grown stronger through the aftermath, built on a foundation of her choosing to believe me and support me even when it destroyed her marriage and forced her to confront how thoroughly she'd been deceived. Gregory sent a letter from prison 8 months into his sentence. It was addressed to my mother in care of Teresa's address since we'd both moved and left no forwarding information. The letter was a rambling mess of self-pity and blame, claiming he'd been set up, that the evidence had been manipulated, that he'd been going through a mental health crisis nobody had bothered to recognize, that if we'd all just tried to understand him instead of immediately assuming the worst, none of this would have happened. My mother had shown me the letter, asked if I wanted to read it. I'd declined. Whatever Gregory wanted to tell himself to survive prison was his problem, not mine. There was nothing he could write that would change the video evidence, the timeline, the systematic pattern of violation he'd committed. His revisionist history was irrelevant to reality. Teresa had put the letter through the shredder without comment. 2 years post-sentencing, I graduated college with honors. My mother threw a party at her new house, inviting family and close friends who'd supported us through the trial and aftermath. The celebration was filled with people who'd believed me, who'd stood by us, who'd understood that protecting predators was never worth maintaining fake family peace. The relatives who'd defended Gregory, who'd sent threatening letters about loyalty and legal action, who'd claimed I'd fabricated everything out of teenage vindictiveness, weren't invited and wouldn't have been welcome anyway. During the party, my aunt who'd apologized after the BBQ pulled me aside and told me she'd been sharing my story, without identifying details, with other parents as a cautionary tale about believing kids when they express discomfort, about not dismissing concerns as paranoia or oversensitivity, about how predators often look like normal, helpful community members right up until evidence proves otherwise. She said multiple families had thanked her for the warning, had started having more direct conversations with their children about boundaries and privacy, had reconsidered relationships where kids seemed uncomfortable around certain adults. That, more than the guilty verdict or prison sentence, felt like the most meaningful outcome. Not just protecting myself, but potentially preventing other kids from having to go through what I'd experienced, because their families would take concerns seriously, instead of dismissing them like mine initially had. Gregory served 4 years of his 6-year sentence before being released on parole. According to monitoring records that Detective Chen occasionally updated me about since I'd requested notification of his release, he'd moved 2 hours away to his parents' house since nobody else would take him in. He'd registered as a sex offender as required, worked a minimum wage job at his father's small business since nobody else would hire him, and lived under restrictions that prevented him from going near schools, parks, or any place where children regularly gathered. His life had been reduced to exactly what he'd stolen from me: privacy violations, constant monitoring, inability to exist without documentation of his whereabouts, everyone around him knowing the details of his criminal behavior. Except unlike me, who'd done nothing to deserve that treatment, Gregory had earned every restriction and consequence through his own choices. I never saw him again after sentencing. Never needed to, never wanted to. He existed somewhere in the world as a cautionary tale, a registered offender, a man who'd destroyed his own life by systematically violating his stepdaughter's privacy because he'd thought he was clever enough to avoid consequences. He'd been wrong. 3 years after Gregory's sentencing, I was sitting in my own 1-bedroom apartment in a city 2 hours from where everything had happened, scrolling through apartment listings for my girlfriend Rachel, who was relocating for work. My life looked nothing like those 17 days when I'd been documenting violations and planning escapes and wondering if anyone would believe me. I had a degree, a good job in victim advocacy, working with a nonprofit that helped people document abuse and navigate legal systems, and relationships built on actual respect rather than performance and manipulation. My phone rang with an unknown number I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Detective Chen, who I hadn't spoken to in over a year since the last routine monitoring update about Gregory's parole status. She informed me that Gregory had been arrested again, parole violation initially, for being caught near a high school where he'd been specifically prohibited from going. But the arrest had led to a search that revealed he'd been taking photos of teenage girls at a shopping mall, violating multiple terms of his release. He was going back to prison to serve the remainder of his original sentence plus additional time for the new violations, and likely facing new charges depending on what forensic analysis of his phone revealed. I'd asked Detective Chen how someone could be that stupid, to risk everything by repeating the exact behavior that had already destroyed his life once. She'd said that some people never actually learn, never accept that the problem was their behavior rather than getting caught, never develop the capacity to see other people as humans rather than objects for their gratification. Gregory was clearly one of those people. The news didn't make me feel vindicated or satisfied. It just made me tired, knowing that he'd learned absolutely nothing from consequences that had already cost him his marriage, his career, his reputation, his freedom. But it also confirmed that my instincts 3 years ago had been correct, that the behavior I documented wasn't a temporary lapse or mental health crisis like his defense had claimed, but a core part of who he was that would have continued and escalated if I hadn't stopped it. My mother had moved on completely. She'd started dating someone new about a year after the divorce, a widower she'd met through her book club who treated her with obvious care and respect. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, with my mother being explicitly clear about her past and her need for transparency and honesty. I'd met him 6 months into their dating, watched how he interacted with her, how he talked about his late wife and his adult children, how he navigated boundaries without being told what they were because he actually possessed basic emotional intelligence. They'd gotten married in a small ceremony last spring. I'd stood up as my mother's maid of honor, watching her marry someone who actually deserved her, who made her laugh without making her doubt herself, who treated her like a partner rather than a cover story for his predatory behavior. During her vows, she'd included a line about second chances being gifts we give ourselves when we're brave enough to demand better. And I'd known she was talking about more than just finding new love after divorce. Teresa and Mike had become even closer family than they'd been before, the kind of chosen family that shows up without being asked and supports without conditions. Their house was still my safe space when I needed it, even now that I'd built a life that didn't require constant safety nets. They'd hosted holidays and celebrations, welcomed Rachel into the family without hesitation, treated me like the daughter they'd always advocated for, rather than the niece who'd needed rescue. The extended family had sorted itself into clear categories. Some had been immediately supportive and remained close. Others had eventually come around after seeing the evidence and acknowledging their initial doubt had been wrong. A few had doubled down on defending Gregory and protecting predators, and those relationships had ended permanently without regret or second thoughts. Family, I'd learned, was about behavior and choice, not just biology and obligation. I'd given several talks at my alma mater about documentation of abuse, about trusting instincts when something feels wrong, about the difference between paranoia and legitimate concern. Students would approach me afterward sharing their own situations, asking advice about evidence collection or legal resources, or how to get family members to believe them. Each conversation reminded me why I'd chosen victim advocacy as my career, why helping other people navigate systems that often dismissed or minimized their experiences felt like the most meaningful work I could do. Rachel had asked me once, early in our relationship, if I ever regretted how I'd handled things with Gregory. If I wished I'd confronted him differently, or tried to resolve things without legal involvement, or given him chances to stop before I documented everything and destroyed his life. I'd told her the truth, that I regretted nothing except not trusting my instincts sooner, not installing that camera after the first bathroom visit instead of the 20th, that Gregory had every opportunity to respect boundaries, to be a decent stepfather, to exist in our home without violating my privacy. He'd chosen his behavior repeatedly over months and years, and my documentation had simply made visible what he'd been doing in the dark. Consequences weren't cruelty. They were justice that took entirely too long to arrive. My apartment now had locks that only I controlled, a security system I'd chosen and programmed myself, and cameras monitoring entry points that sent alerts to my phone whenever any motion was detected. Not because I was paranoid, but because I'd learned the difference between reasonable precaution and violation, between protecting yourself and controlling others, between documentation for safety and surveillance for gratification. Last week, I'd received a LinkedIn message from a woman I didn't know, asking if I was the same person from the case that had been covered in a local news piece about surveillance abuse and victim documentation. She'd said her teenage daughter had been expressing discomfort about her stepfather's behavior, and she'd been dismissed by family members as overreacting until she'd read about my case and recognized similarities in the patterns. She'd installed cameras, documented 6 incidents over 2 weeks, and was now filing for divorce and criminal charges, with evidence that made her daughter's concerns impossible to dismiss. I'd responded with resources, with Detective Chen's contact information, with encouragement that she was protecting her daughter by believing her even when it cost her a marriage. She'd thanked me for sharing my story publicly, for making it possible for other families to recognize predatory behavior before it escalated further, for providing a roadmap of how to document and report and escape situations that too often stayed hidden because victims were dismissed as paranoid or oversensitive. That message sat in my saved folder now, a reminder that the worst 17 days of my life had created something beyond personal justice, a template, a warning, a validation for anyone else whose instincts were screaming that something was wrong, but who'd been gaslit into questioning their own reality. Gregory was back in prison serving extended time, his parole had been permanently revoked, and his lifetime registration as a sex offender meant that everyone in any community he'd eventually land in would know exactly what he was and what he'd done. His parents had stopped defending him after the second arrest, finally accepting that their son was who the evidence proved him to be, rather than the victim narrative they'd preferred. His name was permanently attached to criminal records and news articles and warnings that would follow him forever. Meanwhile, I was building policy proposals for better documentation standards in abuse cases, dating someone who respected boundaries without needing extensive explanations, planning a vacation to somewhere I'd always wanted to visit, and living a life completely free from the hypervigilance that had defined those months of violation. Sometimes people asked if I ever wondered how different things might have been if I'd never installed that camera, if I'd just accepted Gregory's behavior as boundary issues or stepfather awkwardness or something to tolerate for the sake of family peace. But I knew exactly how things would have been. The violations would have escalated. My discomfort would have increased. My concerns would have continued being dismissed. And eventually something worse would have happened because predatory behavior doesn't improve on its own when victims stay silent. The camera hadn't created the problem. It had simply made invisible behavior visible, provided undeniable evidence of what I'd been trying to tell people was happening. And the consequences that followed were entirely earned by someone who'd made calculated choices to violate his stepdaughter's privacy because he'd thought he was clever enough to never face repercussions. He'd been wrong. I'd been right. And the 17 days I'd spent documenting his violations had protected not just me, but potentially every other teenage girl he might have had access to if his behavior had continued unchecked. The system had worked because I'd made it work, by refusing to be gaslit into silence, by trusting my instincts enough to document reality, by demanding accountability even when it cost me a family structure I'd thought I wanted. 3 years later, I regretted nothing except that I'd ever had to share a house with someone who'd saw me as an object for his gratification, rather than a human being deserving respect. But that regret belonged to Gregory, who'd destroyed his own life through choices he'd made repeatedly despite knowing they were wrong. I'd rebuilt mine into something better than it had been before, surrounded by people who'd earned their place in it through support and belief and respect. And that was its own kind of justice, the kind that lasts long after courtroom verdicts and prison sentences, the kind that actually matters in building a life worth living. Gregory would eventually be released again someday, decades older, permanently branded, his opportunities permanently limited by choices he'd made when he'd thought he was untouchable. But I wouldn't be checking for updates anymore, wouldn't be monitoring his location or parole status or new violations. He'd earned his consequences, served as a warning to others, and ceased to be relevant to my life beyond being the reason I understood exactly how strong I was when tested. The girl who'd installed a camera disguised as an air freshener had become a woman who helped others document their own evidence, who advocated for victims who weren't believed, who built policy to make it easier for people to prove what they already knew was happening. And the man who'd called her paranoid at a family BBQ was serving extended prison time for exactly the behavior she'd tried to warn everyone about. Some stories end with reconciliation and forgiveness. This one ended with accountability and permanent consequences. And I'd never been more satisfied with an ending in my life.